Welcome to the lecture for Basics of Biblical Hebrew, Chapter 13, where we will study the Qal perfect stem with the strong verbs. Now, the Qal stem is the most important stem in the Hebrew verb system. It's the base stem, the stem from which all of the other verbal stems are derived. In fact, we do call the Qal stem the basic or base stem. In fact, the word Qal means simple or light, representing the fact that this is the basic stem or the fundamental stem from which all other stems derive their form and meaning. We call the other stems, therefore, the nifal, the pl, the pual, etc., derived stems. The Qal stem is the base stem. All of the other stems, the nifal through the hithpael, are the derived stems because they derive their meaning in some sense or their form from this base stem, the Qal stem. Now, the Qal stem is so important that we're going to be spending the next 10 chapters in the grammar on the Qal stem. Let's look at our screen together and see some of the important facts about the Qal stem together. First, note that the Qal stem constitutes 69% of the Hebrew verbal system. There are some 72,000 verbs in the entire Hebrew verb system that appear in the Hebrew Bible. 50,000 of those verbs are Qal verbs. So you can see the Qal stem is not only fundamental to the other stems, but it's the stem that occurs most commonly in the Hebrew Bible. Second, Qal stem verbs are active in voice with the simple or unnuanced type of action. So that's one of the reasons that we call it the base stem, because it's simple, unnuanced, and active. Let's look again at the screen. The simple action of the Qal stem is further divided into transitive, intransitive, and stative. Now, transitive, intransitive, and stative are types of verbal realities that you may not be familiar with. So let's take a moment and look at what these transitive, intransitive, and stative verbs represent. First, look at your screen with me. Transitive verbs are those verbs that can take a direct object. In the example, the prophet wrote the book, the verb wrote is transitive because it can take a direct object. In this example, the word book is the direct object of the verb wrote because it receives the verbal action. Let me put it this way to you. If a verb can take a direct object, which most verbs can, it's a transitive verb. It's a verb that wants to send its verbal action to an object. Let's look at the intransitive verb. If a transitive verb is a verb that can take a direct object, the intransitive verb cannot take a direct object. In the example, the king perished in the battle, the verb perished cannot take a direct object. Transitive verbs take a direct object. Intransitive verbs are unable to take a direct object. Now, that slight difference between transitive and intransitive will become important as we advance through our study of the grammar, looking at different types of verbs and the action they represent. The third type of Qal verb is the stative verb. Let's look at our screen. Stative verbs are used to describe a state of being. In the example, the priest is old, the verbal construction is old describes the state or condition of the subject, the priest. In English, a stative or state of being idea is expressed with a form of the verb to be and an adjective, is old. In Hebrew, a stative idea is expressed with various verbs such as kaved, to be heavy, and katon, to be small. Most stative verbs are also considered intransitive. So let me review. For the Qal stem, there are three subcategories of verbal action or verbal states. There's the transitive verb, and transitive verbs can take direct objects. There's the intransitive verb, and an intransitive verb cannot take a direct object. Then there's the stative verb, and the stative verb describes a state. That's why we call it stative. Transitive, intransitive, and stative. It's good that you have a good working knowledge of these different types of verbal realities so that when you're thinking about verbs and looking for objects and subjects and how these verbs work, you'll have the categories to properly analyze and think about the verbs as we work. For now, you don't need to worry about being able to classify each verb that you see as either transitive, intransitive, or stative. It'll come to you naturally as we progress through the language. You'll also see the different definitions in your vocabulary section, and you'll make sense of them as either transitive, intransitive, or stative. Simply learn these terms, digest the phraseology so that when we speak about transitive, intransitive, or stative verbs later, you know what we're talking about. Now that we've introduced you to the Qal stem, I want to introduce you to the perfect conjugation. In this chapter, we're going to be talking about Qal stems in the perfect conjugation. Let's look at our screen and see what we need to say about the perfect conjugation. First, the perfect conjugation is used to express a completed action or state of being whether in the past, present, or future. Now this is slightly different than English verbs and how we normally think about verbs. In English, we think about verbs as being either past tense, present tense, or future tense. Verbs that describe primarily time and orientation with reference to the speaker when he wants to portray time. In Hebrew, tense, or the time of a verb, is a secondary notion, something that we derive from context. The primary significance of a verb in Hebrew for the perfect and the imperfect is not tense or time, but aspect. That is the type of verbal action. Is it a continuous type of verbal action? Or is it a perfective or completed type of verbal action? Now that may seem odd at first, but it's a good category to get in your head. If you've had Greek, you'll be familiar with the same type of situation where the Greek verbs express aspect over tense, aspect over tense. Hebrew does the same thing. It's a language that in its verbal system has a heavier emphasis on aspect, a lighter emphasis on tense. So with the perfect conjugation, the action expressed by the perfect verb is a completed aspect, a completed type of action. Let's look at our screen again. The perfect conjugation is sometimes called the suffix conjugation, This is because different inflectional endings called suffixatives are added to the verbal stem in order to indicate person, gender, and number. Now what does that mean? In English, we normally have one verb, and we can indicate the person of that verb by adding pronouns before the verb. I study, you study, he, she, or it studies, we study, you study, they study. So we'll add these different pronouns to our verb to indicate the person who is studying. In Hebrew, you do not need a personal pronoun to indicate who is studying. What Hebrew does is they add certain endings, suffixatives, to these verbs, and these endings indicate person, gender, and number. Now we'll see that more clearly when we look at the paradigm that's coming up, but for now, you just need to be aware of the fact that in Hebrew, you're going to see verbs, and all the verbs are going to have different sets of endings. These endings indicate person, gender, and number. Let's look at the slide again. In Hebrew, perfect verbs are most often translated by the English past tense, for example, I wrote, or the present perfect tense, I have written. Now, I've already told you that the perfect verb in Hebrew is used to express a completed type of action, an action that the author views as whole or completed or finished. Normally, the way in which that comes across in English as a tense-based language is with a simple past tense. However, this perfective aspect can indicate completed action in the past, present, or future. But at the very beginning of our study, we need a default translation to begin with. Look at your screen, and you will see now the Cal-perfect strong verb paradigm. This is perhaps the most important part of the chapter. This is the Cal-perfect paradigm that you must memorize. It's the Cal-perfect paradigm for the strong verb. And when I say you must memorize it, I'm not just making that a suggestion. That's one of the most important features of this chapter, and you must memorize it like a robot. That is, you must have computer-like recall, instant recall, instantaneous, all the time, never stumbling, never thinking twice about it. The better you know this paradigm, the more accurately you know each detail of each form, the better you will be able to read Hebrew, translate Hebrew, and encounter all the other weak verb variations without difficulty. If you fail to memorize this paradigm like a robot, the rest of your studies with the Hebrew verb system will be hampered. So let's memorize this paradigm together like a robot. Now, let's practice by saying it together, and then I'm going to talk about some of the features in the paradigm. Look at your screen with me. I'm going to read the perfect paradigm, which is in the center column of the chart. I'm going to read from the top to the bottom, one word at a time. When I'm finished reading the series of verbs, we'll come back and make some comments. Let's begin. Katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti, katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. Let's read this together again. It's very important that you can hear this properly and pronounce it with me. Katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti, katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. Very good. Now let me make some comments about the nature of this paradigm in terms of how it's presented to you. The first thing that you may have noticed is that this particular paradigm begins with the third person, moves to the second person, goes to the first person in the singular, and then repeats that pattern in the plural, third, second, first. In English, we begin our paradigms with the first person, move to the second person, then the third person, singular and plural. We do something like I study, you study, he, she, or it studies, singular, and then plural, we study, you study, they study. In Hebrew, because the language is slightly backwards, it's a right to left language, not a left to right language, we begin with the third person. We move to the second person, then the first person, singular, and then plural. Now this may be a little bit awkward at first, but after a little while, it'll be totally natural to you. It won't even present any difficulty. It's something, however, that because this is a new system, you need to be careful to take note of how it's presented. You'll also notice that each particular form has a distinct or unique person, gender, or number. Person, gender, or number. You see that in the left-hand column, for example, 3MS, 3FS, 2MS, 2FS, and 1CS, all the way down to 1CP. The person, gender, and number of each verb is indicated by the unique ending highlighted in red on your screen. With regard to person, for the Hebrew verb, there is first, second, and third person. With the first person verb, the speaker is talking about or including himself in the conversation. With a second person verb, the speaker is including someone else with him or herself in that conversation. And with third person verbs, whoever is speaking is not including themselves in the conversation, but is speaking about something or someone else, either in the singular or plural. So every Hebrew verb has person, first, second, or third. In addition to person, Hebrew also has gender. The genders are masculine, feminine, and common. Now you'll recognize these genders from your study of the noun system. Masculine verbs will refer to masculine things or persons. Feminine verbs will refer to feminine things or persons. And then common verbs will refer to something that's either masculine and feminine or both masculine and feminine. So Hebrew verbs have person and gender and then number. With regard to number, Hebrew verbs can be either singular or plural. Singular verbs refer to one thing, plural verbs refer to more than one thing. Hebrew verbs have gender, they have number, and they have person. And these three things are indicated by the perfect conjugation by the distinctive endings. So let's look at your screen again and you'll see these distinctive endings highlighted in red. First, notice that the 3MS form, which is your base form and you will learn as your lexical form of the verb, does not have an ending marked in red. The 3MS form, or the third masculine singular form of the Cal perfect, is the lexical form and it has no special endings. You'll identify this verb as Cal perfect 3MS because it doesn't have a special ending. All of the other verbs that you'll see on this chart, from the 3FS to the 1CP, have particular endings that are highlighted for you in red. Those red endings indicate the person, gender, and number of each verb. So as you see in the far right-hand column, each of the translations, he killed, she killed, you killed, etc., the pronoun associated with the English translation, he, she, you, I, they, we, is derived from the sufformative, or that thing which appears in red on your chart. It's the ending of the Cal perfect verb that tells you the person, gender, and number of the verb. Now this is different than English. In English, we simply add a pronoun to a verbal form that doesn't change. In Hebrew, they have a verbal form that changes, and you need no pronouns. You must memorize this paradigm like a robot. To that end, let's look at our screen together and say it together one more time. Let's begin with the 3MS. Katal, katala, katalta, katalt, katalti, katalu, kataltem, katalten, katalnu. Now, while you're looking at this paradigm on your screen, I want to point out a couple of important morphological features. Number one, when you're memorizing this paradigm and writing it out, you need to be certain that you include every vowel mark and accent mark presented on the page. Every vowel and accent mark on that paradigm must be reproduced exactly. So let's look together at the 3FS form, katala. You'll see that in the first syllable, following the comets, is a small vertical stroke to the left of the comets. you'll recognize from your study of the noun system that that little vertical stroke is called the metheg. That metheg marks that particular vowel as a comets, a long A vowel, not the comets atuf, the short O vowel. So we pronounce this as ka-tla, ka-ta-la. 3 syllables, ka-ta-la. When you're writing the paradigm, make sure that you include the metheg in your spelling of the 3 FS. One other form also has that metheg, marking the vowel as comets. Look at the 3 CP form, ka-ta-lu, ka-ta-lu. 3 syllables. You'll see in that first syllable, the comets is followed by the metheg. That metheg must be reproduced when you're writing the paradigm to remind you that that's the comets and the comets atuf. Remember this paradigm like a robot. Remember those methegs like a robot. 3 other forms that you need to take note of. You'll see that with 3 forms, an accent mark is indicated on the verbal form. The 2 MS, the 1 CS, and the 1 CP. These 3 forms are not accented on the final syllable, but on the second to the last syllable, and so we've indicated that accent with an accent mark in each case. When you're writing your paradigms out, include the accent mark on the 2 MS, the 1 CS, and the 1 CP forms. This will become important later when some of these verbs will change when you add additional endings or when you add things to the front of a verb. The accent marks and the methegs are a vital part of the memorization of this paradigm. Don't fail to memorize them. And when you memorize them like a robot. Once you memorize the Cal perfect verb with your paradigm verb katal, you'll be able to identify any other strong verb in terms of its person, gender, and number because it will follow the exact same spelling pattern of the strong verb katal, your paradigm verb, in every case. Let's look at your screen again together. You'll see on your screen now 5 other Cal perfect strong verbs. If you read through the paradigms in each case, you'll notice that the vocalization or the pointing for each verb in each series is identical to the Cal perfect strong verb with the paradigm verb katal. For example, let's just read through the very left-hand column, the verb yashav. The verb yashav is inflected as a strong verb in the Cal perfect. Yashav, yashava, yashavta, yashavt, yashavti, yashavu, yashavtem, yashavten, yashavnu. In each case, the vocalization of the verb is identical to the vocalization of the strong verb with the verb katal, your paradigm verb. So what you'll observe is that once you've memorized the Cal perfect strong verb paradigm with the paradigm verb katal, all of the other Cal perfect strong verbs will follow that pattern. They'll exhibit the same vocalization or spelling patterns in each form. So once you memorize one paradigm, you'll have access to hundreds or even thousands of verbs that follow that same spelling pattern. That's why we spend time on the paradigm, memorizing the paradigm. It will give you access to all those other verbs. Very good. Now before we move on to talk about stative verbs, I want to talk about 2 spelling features that will crop up with some frequency that you need to be aware of. Let's look together at the slide. When a verbal root ending in tau receives a perfect sufformative beginning with tau, the 2 identical consonants will become one consonant with a dogish forte. Now, 5 of the perfect sufformatives end with a tau. And so when you have a verbal root that ends in a tau and a perfect sufformative that begins with a tau, you'll have, in essence, 2 taus in a row. You'll know that Hebrew does not like 2 identical consonants in a row. And what they will do is they will take those 2 consonants and write them as one consonant with a dogish forte. So look on your screen with me again, and you'll see in the very left-hand column the 5 perfect verbs that have sufformatives beginning in tau, with the verbal root karath that also ends in a tau. In the left-hand column, you'll see the tau of the verbal root in red and the tau of the perfect sufformative in black. Then you'll look in the next column, in the right column, and you'll see that the red tau of the verbal root has disappeared. Where did that red tau go? It's been assimilated into the second tau, the tau of the perfect sufformative, and now it exists there as a dogish forte. Now, if you pronounce these constructions, they're fundamentally pronounced the same way. The only difference is the spelling. So in this particular instance, you're going to have to reconstruct the verbal root. That is, you're going to have to see the 2 root letters and the sufformative. Now you can't look up this verb with only 2 root letters. This root has 3 root letters, kaf and resh and tau. But the tau of the verbal root has disappeared. It's been assimilated as a dogish forte into the tau of the sufformative. So this is a slightly tricky morphological condition. It doesn't occur in every verse of the Hebrew Bible, but you will encounter it. And so it's important to know that in instances where you have these 2 identical consonants lining up, the first one is going to disappear, and it's going to become a dogish forte in the second identical consonant. Similarly, verbal roots that end in noon do this very same thing. Let's look at your screen together. When a verbal root ending in noon receives a perfect sufformative beginning with the noon, the 2 identical consonants become one consonant with a dogish forte. The only sufformative that begins with a noon is the 1CP. The final noon of a verbal root may also assimilate into the sufformative ending in tau. Now, here's what I'm talking about. You've already encountered the fact that noons love to disappear. They love to assimilate into the following consonant as a dogish forte. That's going to happen on occasion in the cal-perfect paradigm with these strong verbs. They're going to assimilate. Whenever you have 2 consonants that are identical, assimilation, tau and tau. Now the noon also likes to assimilate. So let's look at your screen again at the 2 examples. The first example, shekanu. You have the 1CP sufformative nu and the verbal root shekan, shin, kaf, noon. The noon of the verbal root and the noon of the perfect sufformative don't like to be together, noon and noon. So what they do is the first noon, the noon of the verbal root, assimilates into the second noon as a dogish forte. So shekanu becomes shekanu. The exact same pronunciation, it's just spelled differently with 1 noon, not 2. Let's look at the second example. Nathanti, nathanti. Here you have the verbal root nathan, noon, tau, noon, followed by the perfect sufformative t that begins with a tau. The verbal root terminating in noon will assimilate that noon into the tau of the perfect sufformative. So nathanti becomes nathati. Let me say that again. Nathanti becomes nathati. The noon of the verbal root has assimilated into the tau of the perfect sufformative. Now you've seen the noon assimilating in the noun section. Recall that the preposition min can be prefixed to nouns, and when it is prefixed to a noun, the noon of the min preposition will assimilate as a dogish forte into the word it's prefixed to. This is the exact same phenomenon, so it's nothing new. You're just learning that that occurs in another context. That occurs in another context. Now these 2 features are important to learn for this reason. When this happens, you will only see 2 verbal roots remaining, not 3. Most of the Hebrew verbs you'll encounter in the Hebrew Bible have 3 verbal roots. So when you want to look up a verb in the lexicon and you only see 2 roots, you'll have to reconstruct the 3rd verbal root. In these 2 cases, you'll have to reconstruct the 3rd verbal root. Is the 3rd root letter a tau? Has the tau assimilated into another tau? Or is the 3rd root letter a noon? Has the noon assimilated into the tau, the sufformative? This is a little bit like Hebrew CSI. You'll have to take all the clues and look at the verbal DNA. And once you take those clues and look at that verbal DNA, you'll have to reconstruct the crime scene and see which root letter was lost, which root letter was killed and became a dogish forte. Hebrew CSI. The better you understand this, the easier it will be for you to identify verbs, know their definitions, and if you don't know their definitions, look them up in the lexicon. Next, we'll study the stative verb in the cal-perfect conjugation, the stative verb. Let's look at your screen together. You already know that stative verbs describe a state of being. But now you're going to learn that stative verbs are classified by their stem vowel, The stem vowel is the vowel that is associated with the second root consonant in Hebrew. The stem vowel is the vowel that is associated with the second root consonant in Hebrew. Now let me say this with you. This is a very important feature of the language. We're going to talk about stem vowels all the time. The stem vowel in a Hebrew verb is the vowel that exists between the second and the third root letter. The second and the third root letter. Let me demonstrate on my screen what I'm talking about. I'm going to begin by writing the paradigm verb katal. So in this particular form, the stem vowel has not changed location. The stem vowel is always the vowel between the second and the third root letter. In this case, once again, it's the pathic. It's the vowel that exists between the second and the third root letter. It connects the second and the third root letter together in its syllable, ka, tal, ti. It's very important that you're able to understand the location of the stem vowel. Now, some grammars will call this the theme vowel. The theme vowel and the stem vowel are basically the same thing. And in the Hebrew verb system, the stem vowel is very important. The stem vowel is very important. If the stem vowel changes, there may be a change in the type of verb or the type of verbal action. So you want to watch that stem vowel. The stem vowel is a major player in how the verbs work in Hebrew. So to review, the stem vowel is the vowel that occurs between the second and the third root letter. Let's return to our slide describing the state of verbs. Look at your screen with me. With strong verbs that are transitive, the stem vowel is normally pathic, as in katal, shamar, and zakar. With stative verbs, the stem vowel is variable, and there are three classes of stative verbs. You'll see these three classes at the bottom. There are pathic stative verbs, tseri stative verbs, and holum stative verbs. These verbs are classified by their stem vowel. Pathic stative verbs are pathic stative verbs because they have a pathic stem vowel. Look at the examples, gadal, chakam. These look just like the strong verbs that are not stative. The tseri stative verbs have a tseri stem vowel, kaved, zakein. This stem vowel is different than the katal stem vowel, the pathic, and identifies these verbs clearly as stative. Finally, look at the third category, the holum stative category. The holum stative is identified as such because the stem vowel is not pathic and it's not tseri, but as the name suggests, the stem vowel is holum. That's the holum vowel you see in katon and yakol between the second and the third root letter. You'll also notice that in each of the translations given for these 6 verbs you see on your screen, there's a form of the verb to be in there. To be great, to be wise, to be heavy, to be old, to be small, to be able. That particular gloss or translation identifies these verbs as stative. In English, we identify a stative verb, or in English, a stative verb appears as an adjective preceded by a form of the verb to be small, to be old, to be heavy. So not only will the stem vowel tell you that these verbs are stative, in addition to the stem vowel, the definitions that you learn in vocabulary will also indicate that they're stative. Let's look together now at the stative verb paradigms. You'll now see on your screen the 3 stative verbs inflected in the Cal perfect. In the pathic stative, tseri stative, and holum stative categories. Now I want to point out to you that because the stem vowel is not identical to the regular strong verb paradigm, there's going to be some slight variation. Let's look at each of these paradigms together. The verbs in the pathic stative category with the verb gadal are identical to the regular strong verb transitive paradigm from katal. There is no difference in the pathic stative and the regular Cal perfect strong verb. The forms are the same in every instance. The stem vowel is the same, pathic. In the tseri stative category, only one verb form is different than the regular Cal perfect paradigm. In the 3MS category, the very first form you see in the tseri stative category, the stem vowel is tsere. In all of the other forms, the stem vowel reverts to pathic. So only the 3MS form is different. You don't need to memorize this paradigm here. You only need to recognize that with the tseri stative, the 3MS stem vowel is going to be tsere and not pathic. The holum stative category, the third or final paradigm that you see on your page, does exhibit a different stem vowel throughout. It maintains the holum in all of the instances where it hasn't been reduced. You'll see in your paradigm in the 3MS, in the 2MS, in the 2FS, the 1CS, the 2MP, the 2FP, and the 1CP, the stem vowel is O class, not A class. Now, I want you to take a look at the 2MP and the 2FP forms together. You'll notice that the 2MP and the 2FP forms don't exhibit the long holum vowel as the stem vowel, but the short kametz hatuf vowel. The 2MP and the 2FP forms also exhibit the O class vowel, but it's the short vowel kametz hatuf, not the longer vowel holum. Now, you don't need to memorize this paradigm either. You simply need to know that with stative verbs, the stem vowel is variable. In the pathic stative, the stem verb is identical to the regular strong verb. In the sere stative, only the 3ms form is different. It's got the sere stem vowel. In the holum stative category, you have the holum stem vowel throughout, except in the 2mp and 2fp forms, where the holum long O has reduced to the commensative short O. Simply recognizing that the stem vowel is variable prevents you from having to memorize a second paradigm. And here's the key to any language instruction when it comes to memorizing a foreign language. Paradigm memorization should be kept to a minimum. Your brain cannot maintain hundreds or dozens or even a few paradigms over a long period of time to be useful in reading with facility. We want to memorize as few paradigms as possible, but then we want to understand the morphological features of the language as best as we can. By focusing on the morphology rather than the paradigms, we'll learn to read like a native reader faster than if we just assimilated hundreds of paradigms. For that reason, in this chapter, even though I've showed you a number of different paradigms, the only paradigm that you're required to memorize is the Cal perfect of the strong verb with the paradigm verb katal. These paradigms that you've just seen on your screen simply represent examples for illustration. Don't memorize the paradigms, simply understand the morphological features behind the change. Now, before we finish our lecture on this chapter, let me mention two other things. The first is, how do you negate a verb in Hebrew? Specifically, how do you negate a perfect verb? How do you move from he studies to he does not study? How do you negate the verb? Look at your screen with me. Perfect verbs in Hebrew are negated with the negative particle lo, usually translated not. The negative particle may also be spelled lo with the holum wow. That's the longer spelling. It doesn't occur as often. The shorter spelling is more common, but you just need to be aware of both spellings. The negative particle lo is always placed immediately before the verb that it governs or it negates. Look at the two examples at the bottom of your screen. Lo shamartem eth hatoroth. You did not observe the laws. You'll see the presence of the red negative particle in the example. That's the Hebrew word for no or not, lo. Without the negative particle, the sentence would be translated, you kept the laws. With the negative particle, you did not keep or observe the laws. Look at the second example with me. Lo zakarta eth habarith. You did not remember the covenant. The translation not comes from the negative particle lo that begins the clause. Without the negative particle, we would translate this sentence something like, you remembered the covenant. It'd be a positive statement. With the negative particle, it's read as a negative. You did not remember the covenant. So how do you negate the perfect verb in Hebrew? You add the negative particle lo. It's that simple. Finally, let's talk about parsing. Parsing of verbs. Now, if you've studied another language, you may know what parsing is, but if this is the first time you've studied a foreign language, what parsing is will be something as foreign as the language. Parsing a verb is the identification of the component parts of a verb. Now, in our introduction to verbs, we've talked about the fact that Hebrew has different stems, roots, and conjugations. With stems, there's the kal, the nifal, the pl. With the conjugations, there's the perfect, the imperfect, the imperative, the participle. And there are many, many, many different verbal roots. You've seen a lot in today's chapter. The verb katal, to kill. The verb zakein, to be old. The verb yeshav, to sit. You know that these verbs have different verbal roots because they have different series of consonants that make up that verb. When you're asked to parse a verb in Hebrew, you're asked to identify all of the different component parts of the verb. Is it kal or pl? Is it perfect or imperfect? Is it one cs or one cp? What's the verbal root? That is how we parse. Now, when we parse in Hebrew, we want to follow a very specific pattern. Let's look at our screen and we'll see what is parsing. The parsing of a perfect verb requires the identification of verbal stem, conjugation, person, gender, number, and then verbal root. When parsing, you must always give the required information in the proper order as the following examples illustrate. Now, why is that important? Because when you're learning a language, you want to be consistent in your approach to diagnosing the verbal forms. So this is the standard way, the standard series in which we diagnose, analyze those forms, and we list all of the different features. Be consistent. Always use this ordering when you parse. Let's look again at your screen and see what that ordering is. On the very left, you will see an inflected verb, zakarti, or below, shamart. These two verbs are inflected in the cow. So we want to parse the verbs as cow. We list the verbal stem first, always, in our parsing. Then we want to list the conjugation. Each of these verbs are perfect. So we're going to begin with a stem, cow, and move to the conjugation, perfect. After we've identified the stem and the conjugation, we want to identify the person, the gender, and the number. In the first example, zakarti, we know it's 1CS because the perfect sufformative T identifies the 1CS form. Finally, we'll identify shamart as 2FS because the perfect sufformative T is the 2FS sufformative. Then we'll want to identify the verbal root. In the first instance, we see that the verbal root is zakar, zayin, kaf, resh. In the second instance, the verbal root is shamar, shin, mim, resh. Notice in our examples, you'll see that we've included the vowel pointing with the verbal roots. This is not always necessary. At this point, it's perhaps best to include the vowel pointing with your lexical forms. All right, that concludes our lecture for Chapter 13. Remember, the most important thing in this chapter is to memorize the cow perfect paradigm, to know how those sufformatives mark person, gender, and number. Additionally, make sure that when you memorize your cow perfect paradigm, you memorize the exact pointing. You remember that there are 3 accent marks and 2 methags, and those must also appear in your paradigm. You should also write out the English translation following each form so that you reinforce what those perfect paradigm forms indicate.